Hey guys, hey logic class, lesson 49, Subimplication and Superimplication part 1. Okay, so yeah, this lesson is about subimplication and superimplication. As you can see, we added more to our square of opposition, this side and this side. Up to this point, we've learned about contradiction and who remembers the characteristics of the relationship between propositions that contradict. So the relationship between A statements and O statements, E statements and I statements. They contradict each other. What is their relationship? Who can tell me? Basically, if statements contradict, it means that if one is true, the other must be false, and if one is false, the other must be true. So it's the easiest to remember. If E is false, I will be true. If E is true, I will be false. If I is true, E will be false. If I is false, E will be true. Okay? That's a relationship of contradiction. It's the same way with A and O statements, obviously. Okay? We've also learned in our last lesson about subcontrariety and contrariety. Contrariety is the relationship between A propositions and E propositions. I have it, contrariety, written there. You probably can't read it. It's pretty small. My box got a little bit too close to the top of the chalkboard. But these are statements whose relationship is contrary. Okay? Relationships of contrariety. All right? Who remembers the relationship between A statements and E statements? Relationships of contrariety. What are the characteristics of that? Can you tell me? The relationship between an A and an E statement is that they cannot both be true at the same time. Okay? So if one is true, the other is false. However, they can both be false at the same time. So if one is false, the other one may or may not be true. Okay? You can have an A statement and an E statement that are both false, but you cannot have an A statement and an E statement that are both true. Okay? Got it? We already went over that. Subcontrariety is the opposite. It's the relationship between I statements and O statements. Subcontrary propositions, their relationship is that they can both be true, but they cannot both be false. Right? So if you have an I statement that's true, you can have an O statement that's true. However, if one of them is false, you know that the other one is going to be true. Okay? So that's what we've learned so far. Today we're adding subimplication and superimplication. That's the relationship between E and O statements and A and I statements. But before we get into that, and we're not actually going to get into it much today. This is just part 1 of the probably 2 or 3 parts that we'll put into this lesson. So before we get into talking about subimplication and superimplication, let me talk to you guys a little bit about Socratic dialogue. So in your books, there's sections where you're reading about conversations between people, between Socrates and other kids or whatever. And that's giving you examples of Socratic dialogue. And basically Socratic dialogue is conversations where you ask questions. So have you ever been in a conversation where somebody is trying to prove a point and you just start asking them questions? And you say, well, what about this? And what about that? Now you can do this in an obnoxious way that makes it impossible for the person to actually try to explain themselves. And you've probably been in that situation where you're the one asking the questions and you're not really wanting to know, you're just asking obnoxious questions. If you just ask the question, why, you can back somebody into a corner, right? So they say something like, I think the Denver Broncos are the best football team in the NFL. And you say, why? You say, well, they won the Super Bowl 2 years in a row. You say, why? Well, because they're pretty good. Well, you just keep asking why, and nobody knows, and eventually you just can kind of back them into a corner. That's sort of an obnoxious way of of asking questions. But when you ask real, genuine questions, where you really want to know the person's reasons for believing something, then you ask particularly pointed questions that help them to have to really think about what they believe, right? It makes them clarify what they're saying, and it makes them think deeply about what they actually believe. And this is good. It can be annoying if you're the person who's being asked the questions, because it makes you have reasons for what you're saying. But that's what we refer to as Socratic dialogue. It's asking questions to try to get people to really think about what they believe, right? So I'm going to give an example of that. If I said to you, all people should stay home during a pandemic. All people should stay home during a pandemic. Okay, that's a statement, all right? It's a statement of belief. Now, you could just take that for what it's worth and agree with me, or you could give a contrary statement, all right? Maybe your contrary statement would be, no one should stay home during a pandemic, right? So we have two statements. We have two contrary statements. One is an A statement and one is an E statement. They're contrary to each other, okay? One says all S is P, the other one says no S is P. All people should stay home, the other one says no one should stay home, right? So those are contrary. So let's say you give this contrary statement, but then you decide to push back at me a little bit with some questions, right? To try to figure out if I really believe what I said. Okay, I said all people should stay home during a pandemic. So you say, excuse me, let me back up. Let's say I'm the one asking you questions, okay? So you tell me no one should stay home during a pandemic. And I decide I'm going to find out if you really believe that, right? So I'm going to ask you some questions. I say something like, well, I say, why do you think that everyone should stay home? And you say, well, because if you, I say, why do you think that no one should stay home? And you say, well, because if we shut down the economy, hospitals will run out of money, and cancer patients will die, people will run out of food, and they will starve to death. So I think that no one should stay home during a pandemic. We should keep working. We should keep going to work. We should keep the economy going, right? So those are your reasons. So I press you a little bit harder, and I say, well, do you agree that America has the strongest economy in the history of the world? Okay. Yes, that's probably true, right? It is true, actually. Do you agree that if we do have the strongest economy in the world, not in the world, but in the history of the world, we should be able to handle a couple of months of missing work? Think about it a little bit. Yes, probably the strongest economy in the history of the world should be able to handle people not going to work for a month or two. Also, is it true that if people get in really difficult financial situations, the government tends to help them out in our country? In other words, in America, are people starving to death? Not very many. I mean, unless it's kind of a secretive thing where somebody's holding somebody in confinement against the law and causing them to starve to death. In our country, if somebody is in that difficult of a situation, someone helps them out. The government or somebody helps them out with welfare or something, right? So, does that happen in our country? Yes. So people are probably not going to starve to death. Would you also agree that when our economy has gone through difficult times, through slumps and recessions and so forth, that after it's over, it comes roaring back? And if you look at our country's history, yes, that tends to be the case. We go through a recession, we go through a downturn in the economy. When it's over, the economy comes back with a vengeance. It comes roaring back. So So I say something like, therefore, if we stay at home for several weeks or maybe a month or two, it doesn't necessarily mean that people will die of starvation or because they can't get medical treatment. And then you know, if all my points are correct, you would have to say, well, yeah, I guess when I said that no one should stay home, that probably wasn't an accurate picture of my beliefs, or of your beliefs, right? So that's how you help people to really think about what they believe, all right? But now you decide to push back on me. So I made the statement, everyone should stay home during a pandemic, okay? All people should stay home during a pandemic. Now I want you to try to think about some questions you could ask me to see if I really believe that. So think of some questions you could ask me. So you might say, why? Why do you think all people should stay home? I say, well, because that way we could stop the virus and everyone could get back to work sooner, right? And you say, well, should farmers stay home? And I think about that for a little bit. Really, should farmers stay home? Because farmers actually feed our country. And if farmers quit farming, we literally could have mass starvation, right? Or you might say, should doctors stay home? Because the hospitals are full of people with coronavirus. Are you just going to leave them in their beds with no hospital care? If I would think about that a little bit, I would have to say, no, I don't think doctors should stay home, right? Should truckers stay home? You know, who's going to get the supplies from point A to point B? Who's going to take the medicine to the hospitals? Who's going to transport the necessary supplies from place to place? Right now, truckers are actually pretty important, right? So are you going to make them stay home? All of them. And again, I would have to think about that and say, no, I probably wouldn't do that, right? So if we all literally stayed home for a month, like absolutely no one went out, and this is you talking to me, right? We would be much worse off than if we did sensible social distancing, but allow people to keep doing necessary work. And after all that, I would probably have to say, yes, I agree. Not everyone should stay home, okay? So that's an example of Socratic dialogue. And again, that's kind of a simple, oversimplified version of it. But there are times when it's good to challenge people with questions. Now again, you need to be careful you don't do it obnoxiously or in a way that is unfair. You can use questions in ways that are not conducive or not helpful, right? So you need to be careful of that. However, there are times when it's good to ask questions. And it's good when people ask you questions so that you have to think about what you believe. Okay, but did you see what we did there? Did you see what happened? We were talking about contrary statements. We were talking about an A statement and an E statement. I said all people should stay home during a pandemic, so that would be an A statement. You said no one should stay home during a pandemic. That's an E statement. They're contrary, right? And they're both wrong, okay? They're both false. Remember, contrary statements can both be false. They can't both be true, but they can both be false, okay? So that's an example of that. All right, we're not actually going to do any notes today. I just want to give a bit of an introduction to the lesson. We're going to be talking about subimplication and superimplication. And one of the differences between subimplication and superimplication and contrariety, subcontrariety, and contradiction is that subimplication and superimplication go one way. Do you notice that? The arrows go, for subimplication, the arrow goes from E to O. For superimplication, it goes from O to E. And of course, it's the opposite on this side. Some things to remember about subimplication is that subimplication is the relationship between universal propositions and their particulars. A relates to I, E relates to O. The truth of the universal implies the truth of its particular. The falsity of the universal does not necessitate the truth or falsity of its particular. When a universal is false, the truth value of the particular is unknown. Okay? Superimplication. Superimplication is the relationship between particular and universal propositions. I relates to A, O relates to E. The truth of the particular proposition does not necessitate the truth or falsity of the universal proposition. The falsity of the particular proposition implies the falsity of the universal proposition. Okay? So that's just some points about those two. For homework, I want you guys to read pages 101 to 105. No questions to answer. Just read those pages. Try to make sure you understand what they're saying. And we'll keep doing this, and we'll go through this lesson. And we'll learn more about it next time. Thank you.